Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome. We are about to begin the second day of the ASEAN Competition Conference. If you could please start making your way to your seats, we'll be getting started shortly. Delegates, if you would like to access the presentation slides from the ACC sessions held yesterday and today, simply scan the QR code on screen to download the slides. Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the second and final day of the 11th ASEAN Competition Conference. I trust you all had a wonderful time yesterday. My name is Eating, and I'll be your MC for today. We continue our journey today with two important sessions that will round out our comprehensive look at how competition policy can build a more resilient ASEAN economy. Our first session on competition and consumer protection will examine the synergies between competition and consumer protection enforcement, including how their combination can better address market failures and enhance economic efficiency. Our panelists will discuss practical approaches to strengthening this interface, particularly in digital markets, where the boundaries between competition and consumer issues are increasingly blurred. The discussion will focus on how competition and consumer authorities can collaborate more effectively to promote market transparency, prevent unfair practices, and empower consumers to drive competitive outcomes. The session will be moderated by Dr. Walter Terceira, Associate Professor of Economics at Singapore University of Social Sciences. Thank you.
Okay, so I just wanted to welcome everybody back today. Thanks for being here so early. So I just wanted to make some brief opening remarks, I think, on the panel, and then we'll get right into it. So I think, basically the idea here is that competition regulation and consumer protection, there's the same core objective, right? You want to improve economic efficiency, but the reason why you need these policies is we happen to live in this imperfect world, right, where firms are self-interested. There are these asymmetries of power between firms and also between firms and consumers. And finally, we have certain predictable issues that would occur, bounded rationality where consumers can be reliably taken advantage of. So I think given all of this, we do need both of these policies in place. The problem, I think, or the issues that we're going to grapple with is that the framework for actually organizing these policies actually differs a lot by jurisdiction and also by place, right? So for example, in Singapore's case, actually competition policy is administrative law. So CCCS actually investigates, makes findings, right, on whether violations have occurred of Competition Act, and we also impose penalties. Of course, all of this is subject to appeal, but basically it's like your judge, jury, and executioner, right? But for consumer protection, that's actually a different framework. That's a civil law framework. And CCCS investigates, but ultimately it's the courts that make the finding and have to provide redress. But then we have a coordination of policy because CCCS is responsible for both competition and consumer policy. So if there's an overlapping case, we can actually choose which framework to apply or to apply both. So there's an advantage in coordination, but what if we get it wrong, right? Or what if there's a risk that we take the path of, let's say, least resistance because we have limited resources? So is it better or worse to have a coordinated or to have an independent competition and consumer authorities, right? So I don't think we can be prescriptive of what is best, but these are some of the issues that I want the panel to grapple with in their presentations and discussions, because I think the practices differ across all of the ASEAN countries, and so there might be some learnings from how each jurisdiction actually organizes it. So that's how I would think about it today. So let me start by, we're going to kick off things by having Mr. Loh Kiew Meng, who is the Assistant Chief Executive for Legal Enforcement and Consumer Protection from CCCS, and he'll start with the presentation on what CCCS does here in this regard. Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. Walter. So, good morning everyone, and I recognize that we are into the second day of our conference, so thank you very much for coming back. We're very grateful for the support from all our ASEAN colleagues as well as other regulators around the world for participating in this event. I'm going to just start very quickly by covering a bit of context in Singapore. So in Singapore, as you've heard from Prof. Walter, we have a fused system, one where the competition authority also exercises consumer protection powers. And I'm going to just quickly make a trot through history about how this came to be. In 2003, there was a growing recognition on the part of the government that more needed to be done in order to address certain kinds of business behavior. At that point in time, there were criminal laws that were dealing with cheating, with intimidation, but there wasn't effective frameworks to deal with other kinds of behavior like bait advertising and false representations. So at the urging of successive presidents from the Consumers Association of Singapore, and they have been urging the government for quite a while, and through their hard work, the government eventually formed a joint task force to look into the issue and eventually recommended that we create our own fair trading law. And so then in 2003, that is how the Consumer Protection Fair Trading Act came to be. In the same year, there was an economic review committee that was also making recommendations, and they recommended for a generic competition law to be created in Singapore to ensure that we didn't have just competition frameworks that apply to specific sectors, but something that would apply broadly to all aspects of the economy. And in 2004, that then led to the enactment of our Singapore Competition Act. Beyond that, there were also some, and at that point in time, I think the consumer protection functions were actually vested with the Consumers Association of Singapore. And they were the ones who would take matters to court to get injunctions if there were unfair practices. The competition function rested with the then Competition Commission of Singapore. And in 2018, there was a decision taken by the government to then transfer the consumer protection functions over to then CCS, and that's how we acquired the third C in our name, and we became known as the Competition and Consumer Commission of Singapore. So after that, in 2025, just this year, there was a further decision taken to then vest an additional consumer protection function with us, and that was the product safety and legal metrology functions. So now CCCS actually exercises a broader consumer protection mandate. So let's touch on the next issue, which is what exactly is this relationship between competition and consumer protection. And I found my team, when they were helping me prepare these materials, actually they found a very useful quote from Mr. Ronald Moore Bannerman, who was the first trade commissioner in Australia. And he said that consumers not only benefit from competition, they activate it. And they are the ones that basic consumer protection law serves to ensure that consumers are able to then participate in that process. So from this statement, actually, it started, I have some thoughts about it. It suggests also that in a market where competition law is actively working, where there are actually adequate competition protections, it doesn't necessarily mean that the market is going to perform well or as efficient as it should be. Sometimes intense competition or even fair competition can result in bad outcomes. And the reason is because businesses, as they strive to get market share, might actually find that it is more worth their while to start engaging in unfair practices in order to secure that market share. So that's actually the potential downside of intense competition. You see a downward spiral or a race to the bottom in terms of what businesses might try to do. Rather than to compete on the merits, they might engage in some other activities to gain market share. So that's where competition, or rather consumer protection, actually comes in to fill that gap, to make sure that consumers are made aware of relevant information, to make sure that they are not the victims of unfair practices or misrepresentations. And ultimately, you will see at the last bullet point, competition and consumer protection laws work together hand in hand to ensure that market players actually compete on the merits in the market, and the consumers are able to then actively participate in that process. So we can see some of the interplay between the different limbs of competition as well as consumer protection law in some of the market study cases that CCCS has done over the years. The first is the car parts market study. So in this market study, what we did was we looked at the after-sales repair services in the car industry. And we realized that dealerships that were selling cars to consumers included certain warranty clauses. And these warranty clauses required consumers to go back to authorized workshops in order to repair their cars. And they claimed that if you did not do that and you went to a third-party workshop, your warranty, which typically lasts for quite a number of years, would be voided. So we found that that created a competition issue in the industry, because you have these third-party repairers who are repairing cars at a lower cost, but are not able to compete against the authorized repairers simply because of these warranty clauses. So we engaged with the automotive industry, we spoke to them about these concerns, and eventually we got them to agree that they would remove some of these clauses, or even if they didn't remove it, they would not enforce these clauses. But that was not the end of the story. So that was an intervention in 2017. But subsequently, we got complaints from consumers, and they said, when I go to see my salesperson for after-sales services, they still tell me that I need to honor the warranty clause. They still tell me that if I do not go back to the authorized dealer, I'm going to lose my warranty. And that became a misrepresentation, and that became a consumer protection issue. And by that time, if you remember, we only got our consumer protection powers in 2018. By 2024, we were well on our way to basically taking more firmer action, and we were able to then exercise those powers to engage with the automotive industry and to tell them, look, you got to clean up your act, you got to stop making these representations. And I think over time, we've managed to at least get them to clean up that aspect of their practice. So actually from this example, you can see that there are both competition as well as consumer protection issues that can arise in a particular industry. The next case that I'm going to quickly touch on is really about instances where there is active competition, but the problem is because of unfair practices, the market is again not performing efficiently. And we saw this in the funeral services market inquiry that we did. When we started that inquiry, we noted that a number of regulators in other countries had also started to look at this particular sector. And so we thought it was worthwhile to have a look. And when we did that, we started it from a competition angle. And when we looked into the market, we realized it was highly fragmented in Singapore. There were many players catering to various racial groups, catering to various religious groups. So there wasn't really a problem in terms of competition. There was healthy competition. But yet, we found that consumers were particularly vulnerable, because when it comes to these kinds of end-of-life decisions, loved ones are bereaved, they are emotional, they are not able to make effective decisions at that point in time. And therefore, there were consumer protection issues that had to be addressed. What we found were that market players were engaging in certain kinds of behavior. For example, they would tell you, I offer a one-stop shop service to you, suggesting that they would cover all manner of services relating to a funeral arrangement. But that wasn't really the case. In fact, consumers found that they were contracting with multiple parties, and there was actually a business failure somewhere along the line that would affect the consumer. We also found instances where businesses would say, look, I can provide you with X amount of services, but after that, what they would then do is they will tell you, oh, but along the way, I think there are these additional services which maybe you didn't realize, but they are unavoidable services. Like you need to pay for cremation services, and I didn't tell you that upfront. So it becomes an additional cost for a consumer. So consequent to that, the competition within the market was actually not as efficient as it should have been, and we had to intervene. So there we basically educated the businesses, and we actually also came up with a educational piece which we put on this website in Singapore called mylegacy.com. It's meant to actually allow for Singaporeans to go and do their end-of-life decisions early on. You can do your planning a bit earlier. When you speak to funeral service providers, there is a checklist of things that you should clarify with them so that you make sure you secure the relevant information and you make an informed decision. And you don't leave that decision at the end of the day to your loved ones who are then struggling with various issues. I'm going to then cover one next aspect, which is emerging trends. And when we talk about emerging trends in this sector, you simply cannot ignore the digital markets. So what we have here in Singapore is we've noticed that there are certainly a lot of opportunities that are created for businesses, but likewise, digital markets have created some instances, opportunities for there to be unfair practices, opportunities for there to be anti-competitive conduct. And the first example I have here, it relates to price fixing conduct involving in-game currencies. So as a gamer myself, I was actually particularly interested in this aspect. It involved a game called League of Legends. And effectively in this game, what you do is you can actually, as playing through the game, either spend money to acquire what they call diamonds, which are a kind of currency that you use in the game, or as you complete various tasks through the game, you will then acquire more diamonds, which you can then use to upgrade your avatar, your characters, or certain other aspects of the game. But what we found was that there was a derivative market that was created from this, and there were certain young people who were actually using the digital platforms to then start trading in in-game currencies. And they were using the chat logs in the platform to discuss, you know what, maybe we should charge the same prices. So that became a very interesting case for us, because it showed that in digital markets there are also possibilities for anti-competitive conduct to occur, and we had to actually intervene. We had to get assistance from the e-commerce market player to find out who exactly were these young people who are engaging in the behavior, because after all they're not necessarily using their names online. So we got that, we actually reached out to them, we got them to stop the behavior, but at the same time we then worked with the e-commerce platform to put out some educational materials. In relation to consumer protection issues, you do see that there are fake reviews and false hierarchies, the examples that I put there, but these are effectively dark patterns. Not all of them are necessarily unfair business practices, but some of them are. And in this case, we had one particular company, which was Lambercy Detailing. They provided car cleaning, car washing and polishing services, and they used ChatGPT to generate reviews which they posted using their customers' names without the customer's permission. And these were basically all 5-star reviews. So when we found out about this, we had to engage with them, and we got them to basically stop the practice. And that's when we found out that they were literally using AI to do this. And frankly, right now, the level of development in AI is maybe not as sophisticated, and therefore it was a bit easier for us to be able to identify these cases. But you can imagine over time, when AI gets even more sophisticated, it might be very difficult to be able to distinguish between a legitimate post and one that might be created with AI. So this was actually a very good opportunity for us to actually create a bit more public awareness about it. And the last example was really Agoda. In that situation, what they did was they had put out a false hierarchy. They told the consumer that based on the parameters that you've keyed into our search, this is the best result for you. But was it really the best result? Because when we made inquiries, we found out that the reason why certain recommendations were put up was not because they met the parameters, but because they were paying Agoda to be ranked number 1 when the search results came out. So that was actually a misrepresentation, and therefore we had to engage with Agoda. So those were actually a couple of examples I've listed. We've effectively also been trying out various enforcement approaches, and one of them is really collaborating with the e-commerce platforms. And I'm actually quite heartened to see that in the local context at least, our e-commerce platforms have been quite willing to cooperate with us. They've been quite willing to make adjustments to their practices when we engage with them. I think I'm kind of taking up too much time, so I'll just end off with one last item. On a lighter note, what CCCS has tried to do is come up with a... Maybe it will explain itself if you watch it. Yeah, so that was really just an attempt on our part to use a bit of humor to try and cast a bit more light on dark patterns. We've came up with a series of comic strips and videos that we've actually put on social media. So I'm really proud of the work that the team put together to get this out. And it's really just a little attempt to try and use a bit more a lighter note to try and cast light on the issue that everyone's grappling with. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I thought there were some interesting takeaways. One was this idea that competitive markets can still embed market practices, right? In the case of the funeral industry, very competitive, lots of small providers, but still very common unfair trade practices. The other idea, which I think we're going to go back to a bit later, is this idea that platforms nowadays play a pretty critical role, actually, in being a marketplace for various kinds of bad conduct, and then you need to engage the platforms to actually do something about it often. So we'll return to that later. So next I want to invite Ms. Johanna Crozer, General Manager, Competition Enforcement, Coordination and Strategy, Competition Division of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, to do her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you and good morning everybody. It's a pleasure to be here on this panel talking about a topic that's very close to my heart as someone who's been both a competition protection regulator and a consumer regulator, and a consumer protection regulator and a competition regulator during my career. The ACCC, like the CCCS, is indeed a dual regulator, and we firmly believe in the complementarity of competition and consumer protection laws. Our consumer protection laws work in tandem with our competition laws to promote the proper functioning of Australian markets and to deliver better outcomes for consumers, small businesses and our economy. Consumer laws address what is happening on the demand side, and so they are essential for competition. We see the two laws as inextricably linked and mutually reinforcing. Today I'm going to speak about three topics. The first one is a brief evolution of Australia's competition and consumer protection laws, highlighting their complementarity. Also a little trot through history, to pick up on Mr. Luke's phrase. Give some case examples and also talk about our priority setting process, which I think brings out the complementarity in these two different areas of policy as well. So to the evolution of competition and consumer protection laws in Australia. The Australian Parliament first legislated to prohibit restraint of trade practices in 1906. The legislation was concise, just 9 pages in total and with 4 provisions. However, its brevity did not win the day. Australia's highest courts soon delivered judgments that stripped the Act of any meaningful effect, and the following decades were characterised by a high tolerance of anti-competitive commercial practices in Australia. Collusion between firms was widespread and well accepted, with adverse consequences for consumers and businesses. It wasn't until 1974 that we introduced the Trade Practices Act, and this was a watershed moment in the evolution of the regulation of competition and fair trading in Australia. The purpose of the Act was to control restrictive trade practices and monopolisation, and to protect consumers from unfair commercial practices. So the dual function of our laws was captured in that single Act more than 50 years ago. In addition to the main competition prohibitions, the 1974 Act included a regime for economy-wide consumer protection, with a series of prohibitions on misleading or deceptive conduct, bait advertising, coercion and a product safety regime. Since that time, over the 50 years, there's been numerous evolutions in our law. A key one has been a shift in regulatory design beyond reliance on high-level principle prohibitions to the imposition of ex-ante specific obligations in a range of sectors, including energy, telecommunications, supermarkets and a number of agricultural sectors. We then come to the year 2010, which was a pivotal year in Australia, with the introduction of an expanded national consumer protection legislation in the form of the Australian Consumer Law. This was incorporated into the Trade Practices Act, which was renamed as the Competition and Consumer Act. And it was also important in Australia because it was a harmonisation of the consumer protection legislation at a federal level and also at our state and territory level. In expanding the national consumer protection legislation at that time, we were guided by 4 key principles, which are up on the screen. So first, that competitive markets drive consumer welfare and consumers drive competitive markets. Second, that government intervention in the market should utilise the regulatory or non-regulatory tool best suited to each situation. Third, that government policy should not impede the expansion of national markets, rather it should support that expansion. And finally, government policy should empower consumers, protecting them where appropriate. Overall, there was a recognition that workably competitive markets are vital, but competition laws are not always enough alone to deliver optimal market outcomes. There is a role for well-targeted government interventions that address market failures on the demand side. And at the time in 2010, this was considered particularly important in an era of fast-changing consumer markets driven by technological development and innovation. And arguably that has only accelerated since 2010, as we all know, and our laws must continue to keep pace with the changes in modern marketplaces. Just to point out, one of the key things that happened in 2010 as well was the introduction of civil pecuniary penalties for consumer protection law breaches. This really strengthened the ACCC's ability to take enforcement action and provide greater deterrence against contravention. At the beginning, the penalties per contravention were quite low for consumer breaches, but over time they've increased very significantly, and they're now equal per contravention with competition law breaches, signalling the Parliament's intention that both should be considered equally serious. And this has really moved the dial in our ability to be effective as a consumer protection regulator. Last year, our total fines and penalties awarded by the courts as a result of our consumer and industry code enforcement exceeded 500 million Australian dollars. Housing the two functions in a single agency, as is the case in the ACCC and some of the agencies in the room today, offers several advantages, including operational efficiencies and cross-fertilisation between the two areas. At the ACCC, our commissioners, investigators, lawyers and economists are skilled in both areas. Understanding both perspectives helps staff better identify where markets are not functioning well and the reasons why. And it makes us better able to investigate and design appropriate enforcement remedies to make the markets work better. In the area that I'm in at the ACCC, we oversee the competition pipeline of matters, so that's right from initial investigation all the way through to outcomes. And it's often at that stage when we see initial complaints coming in that we're having discussions and making decisions about what is the best way to tackle this particular issue. So the coordination and strategy teams within competition work very closely with those coordination teams in other parts of the agency, like fair trading. And perhaps in the Q&A we can come back to some examples later on. So the ACCC has a strong enforcement record. We strategically manage our enforcement program to use the full suite of regulatory tools available, including litigation to address concerns in Australian markets and to achieve proportionate and appropriate outcomes. Our interventions are focused on complex conduct that presents significant harm and are of critical importance to the community and our economy. I'll just share one example of a recent case that supports improved consumer outcomes. It demonstrates in practice our ability to combine enforcement tools to achieve an outcome that most benefits competition and consumers in a timely way. Last month, the ACCC instituted proceedings against Google Asia Pacific. Google admitted to breaching Australia's competition laws in relation to the understandings it reached in the past with two large Australian telecommunication providers for the pre-installation and placement of Google Search on Android devices, and it agreed to jointly submit to the court that it should pay a penalty of 55 million Australian dollars. Very importantly for us, this outcome was also coupled with a court enforceable undertaking with forward-looking commitments from Google to modify the way that Google distributes Google Search in Australia. The forward-looking commitments, including removing certain pre-installation and default search engine restrictions on Android devices, and the untying of Google Play from Search and Chrome, will deliver meaningful benefits. They'll provide for meaningful change for Australian consumers and allow competitors of Google to be able to compete on their merits. And the timing for this outcome matters. As we heard yesterday, AI search tools are revolutionising the way that we search for information, and it's vital that competitors can gain meaningful exposure to Australian consumers at this time. I should note as well that's before the courts that matter, and it's ultimately a matter for the court to determine the appropriate penalty and orders. Just finally on our priority setting, I've got that slide on the screen already. Every year we go through an environmental scan process to work out what our priorities will be for the year ahead. We have some enduring priorities, which are conduct that we consider so serious that we have them as a priority on an ongoing basis. But we also then set priorities typically which are sector related, and they help guide our decision making for the years ahead, and we have objectives that we try to achieve through that year. Our priority setting process is rigorous, and we look at all the complaint data that we receive as well as other proactive work to work out where the issues of greatest harm are occurring in the economy. I thought it's interesting to note the high degree of overlap, even though we go through separate processes for looking at where are the greatest consumer protection issues in the economy and where are the greatest competition risks. And as it turns out, for this year, we have, for those 5 areas that are up on the screen, overlap. So supermarkets and retail is both a priority in the competition and consumer area. Similarly with essential services, digital economy issues for both environmental claims and sustainability, and also aviation. And then we have a number of priorities which are separate for each of those 2 areas. So overall, our consumer protection role is complementary to our competition role. We rely on different instruments, but both have a common purpose. Together with our competition mandate, our fair trading and consumer protection and product safety work ensures that Australians can participate in markets with confidence. Thank you.
Thank you. So what struck me, I think, was how in Australian law and policy, both consumer and competition issues actually have the same weight or the same similar kind of penalty framework. I thought it was very interesting, and also the case where you talked about with Google, where you applied both tools actually to resolve the issue. So I think the overlaps also in priority areas for the coming year are quite interesting, and maybe you can touch on that a bit later as when we go to the discussion as well. Thank you. All right, so next we're going to have Mr. Xie Fa, Deputy Director General of Anti-Monopoly Enforcement Department 2, State Administration for Market Regulation of the People's Republic of China. So he'll give his remarks now. So Mr. Xie, thank you.
Thank Dr. Walter. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, hello everybody. It's a great pleasure to attend the 11th ASEAN Competition Conference. As arranged by the conference, I will give you a brief overview about China's anti-monopoly policies and practices in protecting consumer interests. To begin with, I'd like to talk about the global consensus on competition policy to safeguard consumer protection. Fair competition is the basic principle of the market economy. Through competition mechanism, consumers can enjoy more independent choices and high-quality products and services. Incorporating the protection of consumer interests into the legislative objectives of the anti-monopoly law is to protect consumer by maintaining competition order at the macro level, which is meanwhile complementing with specialized consumer rights protection laws that focus on remedying individual rights and interests. Firstly, protecting consumer interests is a key foundation for competition policies and is also the main goal of anti-monopoly laws. Anti-monopoly is an important part of national governance. China's anti-monopoly law came to effect in 2008. It was revised for the first time in 2022. Article 1 clearly states that the law aims to safeguard consumer interests and the public interest. This reflects our legislative commitment to consumers. Although the legislative background and wording of articles vary in different jurisdictions, how to better protect consumer interests has become a shared legislative goal, enforcement principle, and judicial consensus across jurisdictions. Secondly, safeguarding consumer interests is an important value orientation of China's anti-monopoly regulations. I will explain specific policies of China's anti-monopoly law enforcement agencies from the following 3 aspects. In terms of regulating monopoly agreements, the anti-monopoly law prohibits monopoly agreements such as fixed prices and market segmentation. The core is that these behaviors will reduce the dividends that consumers should receive from market competition. At the same time, for exemption clauses in monopoly agreements, it must be proven that they can enable consumers to share the benefits arising from them. In terms of regulating abuse of market dominance, the anti-monopoly law prohibits behaviors such as selling goods at unfair high prices and bundling goods without justifiable reasons. When determining the abuse of market dominance necessary to protect consumer interests, able to benefit consumers, and impact on social public interests are all powerful guarantees to protect consumer rights. In terms of regulating concentration that has or may have the effect of excluding or restricting competition, according to the anti-monopoly law, we should consider the impact on consumers and other relevant operators in merger review. The impact of concentration on consumers is listed as one of the factors in merger review in the provisions on the concentrations of undertakings. We need to evaluate the impact on the quantity, price, quality, and other aspects of products or services. When operators use efficiency improvement as a defense, they must prove the efficiency is significant and verifiable and can be fully conveyed to consumers, ensuring the efficiency claim will not become an excuse to harm consumer interests. Next, as the second part of my speech, I would like to share with you China's anti-monopoly enforcement practices. China has a super large market with a total economy output of 134 trillion yuan and 1.4 billion consumers. This needs us to fully perform duties in accordance with the law, strengthen whole process supervision, and effectively regulate various monopolistic behaviors. In recent years, the State Administration for Market Regulation, as China's anti-monopoly law enforcement agency, has made great efforts to strengthen the efficiency of supervision and effectively safeguard the fair competition order as well as the rights of consumers. First, we made overall use of regulatory policy tools such as rule guidance, administrative guidance, interview warning, and follow-up law enforcement to strengthen the whole process supervision. Second, we continue to strengthen anti-monopoly law enforcement in key industry and carried out special anti-monopoly law enforcement actions in the field of people's livelihood for 3 years. Third, comprehensively regulate the market competition order, strengthen platform governance, and punish price and competition violations. In the first half of this year, we filed 11 cases of monopoly agreements and abuse of market dominance and made penalty decisions on 6 cases of monopoly agreements and 2 cases of abuse of market dominance. 339 merger cases were concluded, of which 3 cases were conditionally approved and 1 was prohibited. Finally, I'd like to share the case on safeguarding consumer interests. Pharmaceutical industry is a critical livelihood sector which directly impacts people's life and health. For the cases in this field, we need to concentrate on the balance among the interests of patients, hospitals, and pharmaceutical enterprises so as to protect public interests and safe borderline through fair competition order. I will give an example. The conditional approval of the acquisition of Beijing Tobishi pharmaceutical company by Simcere Pharmaceutical Company. In November 2022, the State Administration for Market Regulation formally filed the merger case. After comprehensive review, we think this concentration would eliminate competition between the undertakings. Moreover, the post-concentration entity might engage in input foreclosure. Consequently, the transaction was likely to eliminate or restrict competition in China's petroxypin injection market. In September 2023, we conditionally approved this case. First, Simcere is required to terminate exclusive API agreements, which eliminates its input foreclosure capabilities. Second, Tobishi and the merged entity must reduce drug prices while ensuring supreme availability, which ensure to spread the efficiency improvement of concentration to consumers. Third, Simcere must divest relevant R&D assets with guaranteed API access for divestiture buyer. This promotes the development of research. The case has approved conditionally, which broke upstream API monopolization, preserved downstream competitors, and maintained market vitality, and it's also direct benefited patients through price reductions exceeding 20%, translating to 40 yuan savings per dose. This is a classic case taking into account of both competition enforcement and consumer protection, representing one of our successful practices. And that's all for my sharing. I sincerely thank you for your concern and support for China's anti-monopoly work. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I think what struck me was how important consumer interest actually in Chinese law and policy, how it's the key for your anti-monopoly regulation. And I think you showed that very well with the case, the pharmaceutical case, where there was the concern that the concentration would eliminate competition, and how you approved that merger in the end with the appropriate safeguards, right? The commitments to stop input foreclosure, to lower prices, and to divest some R&D functions. So I thought that was a very interesting case. Thank you. So now I would like to turn to Dr. Indrani. So she is the Vice President and Legal Advisor for the Federation of Malaysia Consumer Associations. And I think we're very excited to hear from a consumer representative now after all the regulators. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Very good morning. And yes, Dr. Walter, all of us are consumers, be it the business or even the regulators. So I've decided to, give my topic as safeguarding consumers and looking at the interplay between competition and consumer protection. Can I have the clicker, please? Yeah. Is it this one? Yeah. Okay. Thanks. So if we were to see the consumer environment at the moment now, these days it's changing. Those days it was just offer acceptance, consideration and a contract. But now with the digital economy, you see there are so many aspects that a consumer needs to face. You have this fracturing world where you have trade agreements and where consumers' issues are also right at the center of these issues in terms of accessibility, availability, affordability. These are some of the concerns. And then we also talk about the demographics of the consumers. Many of our countries, especially in ASEAN, we are now becoming an aging nation, even though we have youths, but in many of our countries, we have an aging nation, And, then again, our needs are also different. Issues of trust in business, of course, we talked about e-commerce now being, the way forward after the pandemic. We saw how everybody had to shift to being online to access even basic necessities. And then how much of trust is there in the business as well. And then you talk about the civil space, especially the civil society. What you see now is more and more organizations having reduced civic space to engage with policymakers, but then becoming much more adversarial and vociferous. So you see that two different transformation as well. And then of course everybody talked about study about technology, about AI, and the different IoT, cybersecurity, the risk that's involved, and so on. And then of course also geopolitics. Again, we know the trade wars and also the wars that's happening, the tension all over the world. That also has got an implication on the consumers as well, especially when you're talking about access to basic needs, high cost of living. We see that globally happening. And then, of course, last but not the least, on the issue of sustainability. Again, after 2015, where we saw the UN came up with the UN framework for climate change, where governments committed under the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals that government had committed. Again, here consumers play a very key role, because even though if government provides policies, but consumers need to consume sustainably as well to assist government in achieving those agendas. Next, please. So when we talk about, again, the consumer's role, here again we need to see the needs and the responsibilities of the consumer. And again, as everybody had mentioned, competition and consumer protection then are basically both the twin engines that, ensure that the consumer welfare, and there's also the market that really functions well. So they may operate on different frameworks, but they are very deeply interconnected. Next, please. So at the end of the day, it's the ultimate goal of consumer welfare. So in Malaysia, just to talk a little bit about the Malaysian scenario, we have the Competition Act of 2010 that basically protects the competitive processes, focuses market-wide, and of course, it prohibits the anti-competitive behaviors and also the dominant position. And we have the Malaysian Competition Commission, MyCC, and basically it works proactively to benefit all consumers. And then of course we have the Consumer Protection Act of 1999. It's been reviewed a couple of times to add in not only the brick and mortar shops, but also online subsequently. And that's where you see the focus is more on misleading advertisement, unsafe goods, unfair terms, basically that affects the consumer rights. And when we talk about the enforcer, again, it's the Ministry of Domestic Trade and the Cost of Living, as well as under them, they also have the Tribunal for Consumer Claims up to Ringgit Malaysia 50,000, which is about 12,000 US dollars. And then, of course, the key point here is basically a safety net for individual justice or redress mechanism. Next, please. So a little bit about FOMCA, my organization. We were formed in 1973 in Malaysia. We are 52 years, I think, yeah. And we are basically registered under the Register of Society. So we are an association recognized by the government. We are an umbrella body, a national umbrella body that serves as a coordinating consultative role. We work at the national, regional level as well, at the ASEAN. And also at international, we are a member of Consumers International, which is a global network based in the UK that does global advocacy as well. My president is currently now the president of Consumers International as well, coincidentally. And we currently have 18 member organizations that are usually consumer associations and user groups as our affiliates who specialize in key consumer issues. And basically we try to focus on strengthening consumer protection in the marketplace through advocacy, networking, representation. We sit in a lot of policy making committees, I would say across the board, right from transport, health, food safety, housing, everything that is a consumer issues, we have a seat representing the consumer voice. And then of course we additionally do campaigning and consumer education as well. Next please. So just to give you a couple of examples of where FOMCA has made some interventions and our stand where we find sometimes there are market failure that has harmed consumers. So the first instance was actually the more recent one, which is the pharmaceutical market, as also my colleague from China had also shared about that. About, especially with the medical insurance premiums going up, I think not only in Malaysia, but I think across the world, I think that we have seen, the inflation, the medical inflation. And one of the reasons for the medical inflation is also on the drugs prices. And in Malaysia, FOMCA has been always pushing for a national medicine price database, but usually whenever we see the medicines, there is a disparity between the prices that is in the public hospital, private hospital, and in the pharmacy. So of course pharmacies are always much cheaper, so people end up now self-medicating because they do not want to go to, it's too long a queue in the public hospitals, and so they end up, and then it's too expensive to go to the private hospitals or even to the private clinics because the prices are very opaque. They usually put it under, a very general itemized and kind of a billing. So what we have pushed for was actually a price transparency, and the government actually heard our cries, especially when the government found out that many consumers were actually giving up on their medical insurance because of the high premiums, and the general practitioners in the clinics were actually co-opting drug prices together with consultation prices. And so you could see that, so when you go to the pharmacy, you know the actual price, but then when you go to the private clinics, the prices are sky high. So as a result, in May this year, the government came up with the mandatory drug price display that they have asked every pharmacy, private hospital, and also the private general practitioners that they have to mandatorily display the prices. There's been a hue and cry from the medical profession. They did a lot of, usually you see civil society are the ones protesting, but this time you could see a lot of doctors protesting outside Parliament and things like that because they felt that it was going to affect their livelihood. But as far as we know, consumers are the ones who have been affected quite a bit. And many a times, you will see doctors who leave the public hospitals going on to opening their own private clinics because it has been such a luxury for them. And so they felt that this was actually eating into their profits. But at the end of the day, it's been really good. Government has stood very firm despite a lot of media statements from even the medical doctors association and so on, but in May they started this, and now for the next couple of months they are doing monitoring. The Malaysian Health Ministry, they are doing monitoring to ensure that clinics and the private hospitals are complying with this requirement, and as of January next year, there will be fines imposed to those who are not displaying prices. And this is actually very empowering for the consumers in Malaysia, because now they can actually shop around and see actually which clinic is giving a better deal. And those days the medical profession, especially the general practitioners, as I said, they usually twin consultation with the drugs, but now the government has said that you can actually just get a prescription from the doctor and then go to the pharmacy and get your medicines at a lower price. So that's giving consumers a wider choice, and I think that's really a very good example. Next, please. The other one that we also kind of focus on, and this was actually historically we raised this when AirAsia came into play, and then there was a little bit of market sharing between Malaysian Airlines and AirAsia. We raised our concerns, again where we tried to play a watchdog role, but especially during the pandemic, what we saw was that a lot of consumers who were usually in many airlines, if you buy your tickets much earlier, you get it at a lower price. But when the pandemic hit, many consumers were not able to get cash refunds for their cancelled flights because you couldn't travel. You had the lack of movement, and what they were then offered were actually vouchers, and this affected millions of consumers, not only in Malaysia but across the region. And as you know, AirAsia originated from Malaysia, so we actually collaborated with the consumer groups in ASEAN and actually came up with a statement. And again, because many of the consumer associations are also part of Consumers International, so that gave us the strength. But very interestingly, FOMCA was then asked to facilitate by the KCA, that's the Korean Consumer Protection Agency, and also the Japan NCAC, the National Consumer Agency Center. Again, these two agencies were inundated with a lot of complaints from their respective countries because AirAsia had closed their office in these two countries, and consumers were not able to get any communication from AirAsia. And we were asked to then facilitate discussions between the HQ in Malaysia, and we did that because of course we went through Zoom, and we facilitated that kind of a meeting where AirAsia then agreed to discuss with Korea and Japan and to see what they could do to refund the air cancelled flights. So I think this is another way of why there's a need for I would say cross-border and collaboration, especially not only in ASEAN but in Asia as well. Next, please. Another one, of course, is the e-commerce transaction. I know this was also mentioned by Lok just now. But for us, of course, in addition to the issue of non-receipt of the products, misrepresentation, unsafe products, counterfeit goods, we also see that the platforms in Malaysia, we feel that they need to have greater responsibility, especially to vet advertisers and also to make sure that they remove misleading listings. Why we find that as an issue? Because the current law that we have, the Consumer Protection Act, is insufficient to provide consumer redress. So consumers can use the Consumer Tribunal, but the Consumer Tribunal requests details of vendors, and all you get from the e-commerce platform is usually just the name of the vendor. You do not get contact details, you do not get the names, there are no such details. And when you want to go to the Consumer Tribunal in Malaysia, without those details you can't even lodge a complaint. And so that's why a lot of consumers then are not able to get redress. And this is why we've been calling for platforms to be much more, to be held much more accountable. Next, please. So what did we learn from the policy gaps, looking at it from a consumer lens? That the issue of transparency, we find that many of the laws currently are most often very reactive, not being proactive. And that's why now I think the Minister of Domestic Trade has actually done a regulatory framework exercise where I've been invited to sit, as a steering committee member, and we are actually now looking at coming up with a very future-proof e-commerce bill. Hopefully that will be passed by end of this year. And we also find that there is no proactive duty for the industries to provide standardized services or information. And then this, of course, then undermines consumer sovereignty and as well as market competition. The second point that I wanted to raise is about the accountability gap. Again, as I mentioned, as platform owners, usually most of the platform owners say that, we are only merely providing a platform for the vendors to sell. And so we are neutral and we should not be held accountable. But as I mentioned, many of them do take subscription for the vendors. They do have the ability to know the vendors. They have the ability to actually vet them, and that's why we find that most often than not that they have to be held much more accountable. And I think this is very similar to what EU has done more recently. The other area is, of course, then also to look at the issue of redress. Most often the issue of redress is left to the platforms where they come up with the redress mechanism, and we find that sometimes it caters more towards the corporate interest and not to the public interest. So most often we in the Consumer Association then get inundated from consumers saying that I've gone to this platform, I bought something but I was not happy, I was charged things which I was not supposed to be charged, but I'm not getting the relevant redress. And then we have to make interventions on behalf of the consumers again. And so that's why we find that there has to be more accountability. In terms of jurisdictional, again, national laws stop at the border, so that's why it's important to have things which are across the region. And then the last point is about, again, enforcement priority dilemma, where, for example, we have MyCC that looks at competition, and then we have the Consumer Claims Tribunal that looks at the consumer protection, and sometimes under different frameworks with limited resources. So there's sometimes some confusion. Is this something which comes under the competition issue, or is it something more of a consumer protection? So there's a lot of confusion on which tools to use as well. So moving forward, next please. FOMCA's recommendation is to legislate laws that provide transparency. For example, how we did that for the drug price disclosure. We also like the EU right to repair, and this is something that we are trying to also push in Malaysia and hopefully in the region as well, that will allow consumers and independent repair shops to have information about repair as well as access to spare parts, and this will foster competition and sustainability as well, because then you don't have to dispose your products as well. So all in line with the UN SDG goals as well. Then of course to introduce a statutory duty for digital platforms, that they must have this duty of care. There must also be a KPI to monitor or to measure, on a quarterly basis on how they have actually taken up redress mechanisms as well. And also what we have seen is that through the discussions that we have had with many consultations with even the merchants, they themselves also say that there are many bigger platforms usually play a very dominant dominant role, and they do sometimes also impinge on the merchants themselves, where sometimes they are delisted, there are commission hikes, sometimes if they do not participate in some of the programs of these dominant platforms, their ranking is much lower, and thus there's also then an impact for consumers, because now consumers are not getting the right choice as well. And then, of course, the last but not least, of course, is to empower regional cooperation, where ASEAN needs to move beyond non-binding guidelines. We need an ASEAN Consumer Protection Protocol with the necessary mechanisms in place. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed hearing about FOMCA's work actually in the areas of pharmaceutical price transparency, your cross-border collaborations with the case of airline refunds, and of course e-commerce platforms as well. And I thought what was interesting is you also highlighted the policy gaps, and I think there's really then a need for the appropriate regulatory levers to be in place. Presumably with pharmaceuticals that was only possible because the Ministry of Health had some jurisdiction, but in other areas we need new legislation as well. And I think the idea of an ASEAN Consumer Protection Protocol is something that I guess the delegates here can talk about as well, for sure. Okay, so now I think we have the Q&A session. So I think the slide is up that has a QR code. So if all of you could scan that and start submitting your questions. And while you're doing that, I'm going to kick off by asking the panelists to answer one or two questions of my own first. But please do submit your questions, right? So I think the first question I have is a very general one. It's what we've been talking about already in a sense, but that is basically about the interaction of competition policy and consumer policy. And in particular, I think the reality is for a lot of the regulators, we do have limited resources, right? And also the different limbs basically have got different legal frameworks. So, you know, in Singapore, we talked about how competition policy and consumer policy actually operate in quite a different legal framework, one being administrative, the other one being more court-based. So the question then is, well, what option should be chosen and why? You know, when do we choose to use the competition enforcement route versus, for example, the consumer policy route? And so I'm going to actually ask our own Triple CS, Mr. Look, to first give us a couple of thoughts on this, maybe with an illustration from a case that, you know, we've been looking at in the past.
Yeah, thank you. So it's true that when you have a hybrid enforcement regime, such as the one that we have in Singapore, I think it's more efficient in the sense that when you do look at a market and you analyze whether or not there's any failure or any inefficiencies, we have the advantage of being able to have multidisciplinary teams looking at it. I think when I mentioned just now about our market studies, you can see that we are examining the issues not just purely from one particular lens. We usually adopt a more holistic approach. I recognize completely that, you know, there's always going to be a resourcing issue, and sometimes it's not just about whether you are in the same organization, but just even within an organization, there's always this problem about too little butter spread over too much bread. So I think when we analyze this issue, we usually try and determine what is the greatest harm. And in the process of doing that, we also as regulators think about, if I had to squeeze, which one is going to give me the most yield? But typically, we try to adopt more holistic approaches when it comes to our enforcement work. And by and large, when it comes to our interventions, we've been able to effectively use both our consumer protection powers as well as our competition powers. And I think, as Joanna mentioned just now, they are mutually reinforcing in that way.
Thank you. Actually, now I'd like to turn to Johanna, maybe to address this question. Although you will also notice that for some reason there have been a couple of questions addressed to you as well. So if you want to take those now, you're also welcome to instead as well.
Great, yeah, thank you. So just going back to that issue of which is the right tool to use for the particular problem that you're looking at. This is something that we do very actively consider, and I mentioned earlier that the part of the agency that I work in is responsible for that competition pipeline. So I obviously can't give specifics of things that are coming in that we're actively investigating, but I thought just to add a bit of colour and movement For example, something like we might come across a contract which has particular terms in it, a business-to-business contract that prevents particular parties from getting too large, and that's something we could look at either under our unfair contract term provisions as an unfair contract term in a business-to-business contract, which would be under our consumer laws, or alternatively it might actually give rise to SLC concerns, substantial lessening of competition concerns, and could be dealt with under our competition provisions. So that's an example of a problem that we might be thinking about where it best sits in the agency. And similarly, unilateral conduct that may constitute a misuse of market power often will involve elements of conduct that could also be considered under our Australian consumer laws, the unconscionable conduct provisions. And we're also advocating at the moment very strongly for an unfair trading practices prohibition in Australian law. We see that as a gap in our laws at the moment, so we're not capturing all of the conduct that we think should be covered by our existing provisions. So if that is ultimately introduced by the Parliament, that would be another option that we could use for that type of conduct. Perhaps going to your point as well, just about resourcing and having scarce resources. As everyone in this room will know, competition cases are a formidable undertaking, especially substantial lessening of competition cases. So we can often get faster resolutions under our consumer laws. So that's sometimes a consideration. What is the best tool for the right proportionate outcome that's going to lead to the best outcomes in the market for consumers and businesses? Maybe just one question to quickly, about one that's at the top about antitrust enforcement very quickly. I wouldn't say we've become more active lately. We do very much have a strong program of both antitrust enforcement and consumer law enforcement. As I said, competition cases take a long time, so they're in the pipeline for a longer period of time. It just so happens that we've had quite a good set of outcomes in the last month. We had 2 cartel proceedings which were instituted on the 1st and 3rd of September, and also our case against Google on the 18th of August. And we also, during that period, happened to get a couple of important appeal decisions handed down by the full court in our favour as well. So it has indeed been a very active time, but it doesn't actually reflect a change in our priorities. We actively prioritise both parts of the program. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. So on this topic of competition policy and consumer policy, and how can they interact to increase efficiency or self-efficiency, I'd like to ask Mr. Xie Fang to share some thoughts on this.
Thank you. About this question, our experience shows that the two parties may collaborate effectively with each other in key areas, such as information sharing, cooperating, compliance, and case enforcement. First, information sharing. The two parties may establish mechanisms to share information. Competition bodies share market structure, data, and major merger details. Consumer bodies contribute vital complaint data regarding industry trends, key firms, violation types. This combined view gives the complete picture of business conduct and helps decide enforcement priorities. Second, building corporate compliance. Both agencies can jointly help big companies set up strong compliance systems. By putting together the key competition and consumer protection rules and doing joint training, companies understand their obligations better and actually build them into their day-to-day operations. Third, case enforcement. When competition authorities investigate monopolies or review mergers, they should actively consult consumer bodies about how specific deals or actions might harm competition and consumers. If needed, they can also ask their bodies to run market surveys. In China, SAMR works very closely and proactively with consumer groups like the China Consumers Association during enforcement. For instance, we do joint research on how to better assess the merger's impact on consumer rights. In some specific cases, the CCA helped us to conduct stakeholder service so that we can get a more complete view of a deal. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for sharing. Now maybe I'd like to turn to Dato Indrani, maybe to share some thoughts on basically your experiences in FOMCA, basically dealing with issues which overlap. How did you go to the appropriate, framework in Malaysia? Basically, what are some of the issues you encountered? And I believe there's also a question, I think, on there which maybe you would want to consider when you want to deal with. How does FOMCA? Yeah. There was a FOMCA question which has disappeared off. Have you guys seen it? Yeah. One is relating to consumer empowerment, but there was a specific one, I think. Yeah. How does it engage with, these issues in digital contracts? Do you work closely with MYCC? Yeah.
Actually, if you look at some of the issues when you talk about online scams, this is actually, we deal with the Central Bank of Malaysia. So as I said, we actually engage with various government agencies. So we do have a direct contact with Bank Negara on a regular basis. Sometimes I even take certain complaints on a case-to-case basis directly to Bank Negara if I find that the banks are not responding well. There are, sometimes discrepancy in the way the standard operating procedures, so they usually then take on some of our complaints and they then actually put the banks to task and say, you have to do something about this. So if we talk about online scams, it's the Central Bank of Malaysia. If we talk about misleading advertisements, it's the Ministry of Domestic Trade. So we do have a regular, conversation, regular meetings in the various committees of the Ministry of Domestic Trade. They are actually our line ministry, and also on all other related issues. So if it's on health, as I mentioned, on price, then related to healthcare, then we engage with the Ministry of Healthcare. In terms of MyCC, usually if we find, as I said, on the airlines issue, we did raise that issue with MyCC at the initial stage when the commission was set up. And so we do lodge complaints to MyCC, but I guess there's still room for improvement on how we can work. The CEO of MyCC is here, and I think he's going to be speaking in the next session. So I think there is still room for improvement of how consumer groups can actually work with the competition regulator. Actually, this is my first time coming to a competition forum, so I'm glad that I was invited by both the ASEAN Secretariat and CCCS as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to check with the timekeepers, is there time for us to do one more round of questions, or do we have to cut it short now? What do you guys think? We have to. Okay. I think we are actually completely out of time apparently, so we've got to cut it short so that everybody can have their tea break and so on. So I just like to everybody to just join me in thanking all of the panelists for their excellent contributions. It really helped us understand the topic better. Thank you.
Thank you to our panelists for their engaging discussion on how competition and consumer authorities can work together more effectively, particularly in our evolving digital landscape. We'll now have a 15 minutes break. Please enjoy refreshments just outside, and we'll resume at 11 a.m. for our final session. And for those who would like a copy of slides from yesterday's and today's ACC sessions, you can download them by scanning the QR code just on screen. Can we also trouble the panelists for session 6 to just gather back in this room at around maybe 10:50 a.m., 10 minutes before the start of the session? Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. Our final plenary session addresses the role of competition in managing cost of living. Rising living costs represents a significant challenge across ASEAN, and this session explores how competition enforcement can promote market efficiency and prevent price distortion that exacerbates these concerns. Our panelists will explore how robust competition laws can protect consumers and foster economic resilience. The discussion will also touch on practical approaches competition authorities can take to identify, investigate, and address market distortions while avoiding unintended consequences of intervention. This discussion will be moderated by Ms. Cindy Chang, Director of Legal at the Competition and Consumer Commission of Singapore. Let us welcome the panelists.
Hi, good morning everyone. I'm Cindy, and I'm really genuinely thrilled to be moderating this session this morning. Yesterday, we've heard from the other panelists. They spoke about the role of competition law in encouraging economic growth, in spurring innovation. Today, we will be talking about how competition law can help to manage rising cost of living issues. And so rising cost of living issues like rising cost of living is something that's kind of like a defining issue of our times. In ASEAN as well globally and across different sectors, we all feel the pinch as prices go up. So today we're very privileged to have this panel of very distinguished and experienced gentlemen to share with us on how competition law interventions can really help in this regard. The structure of today's panel is really going to be quite free-flowing. It's a free-flowing conversation amongst friends. So in order to minimize interruptions by myself, please allow me to introduce everybody up front. Then I'm going to pass the mic over to the panel. First, we have on my left is Mr. Johannes Bernabe, Founding Commissioner and former OIC Chairman of the Philippine Competition Commission. Johannes is also previously co-chaired the ASEAN Advocacy Working Group and led negotiations for the ASEAN Framework Agreement on Competition. He currently teaches at the University of the Philippines and leads the Law and Economics Advisory Network. We also have Mr. Samuel Chan, who is the chairman of Hong Kong's Competition Commission. He is a practicing barrister, former vice chairman of the Consumer Council and chairman of the Consumer Legal Action Fund Management Committee. Samuel was recently awarded the Bronze Bohemia Star in 2020 for his contributions to promoting consumer interests. We also have Datuk Haji Iskandar Ismail, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Malaysia's Competition Commission. Iskandar has shaped Malaysia's competition law landscape and currently leads amendments to introduce a merger control regime in Malaysia. Iskandar also previously served as chairman of the ASEAN Experts Group on Competition. Last but not least, we have Dr. John Small, who is the chair of New Zealand's Commerce Commission. John is also the founding director of economic consultancy firm COVEC and former head of University of Auckland's Economics Department, with extensive experience in competition analysis across energy, transport, and the telecommunications sector. Okay, so as mentioned, we're going to have a free-flow conversation, so there will be no structure really, but I thought maybe I will signpost that you will listen out for some success stories across ASEAN and also in New Zealand on how competition law has successfully intervened in some markets, fish markets, chicken feeds, roll-on, roll-off, groceries. These will all come out in our conversations. But before that, let me pass the time to Johannes, who will give us kind of an overview on how competition law can play a role in managing rising cost of living issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy, and it's a pleasure to be here. I've always said that I love coming to Singapore because they organize these conferences so well, and this is no exception. The issue that is the topic of this panel relates to something which is relevant to all of us and all those outside the halls of this hotel, and that is the rising cost of living. We always get confronted with the question of what is competition law doing about those rising costs. And I was thinking in framing the discussion points for this session that, well, one, what can competition law do? And what can it not do? Because obviously there are limits to what competition law covers as a mandate for different competition agencies. And then, having said that, I thought, well, there are still areas where competition law can be incredibly relevant and which may be underutilized as tools by competition agencies. And in so doing, what is the balance that should be achieved by competition authorities when trying to push for what is within their mandate and trying to be more surgical in its approach to ensure that when it addresses rising cost of living, it targets those commodities and services which are really at the core of what lies in these inflationary pressures. So let us first of all frame the expectation. In terms of what competition can do, mindful of the fact that, as I said earlier, citizens across not only ASEAN but across the globe are grappling with this unprecedented rise in cost of living, whether it be in terms of rice in the Philippines or fuel costs in Bangkok and elsewhere. These households are feeling the squeeze. And therefore, it seems incumbent upon competition authorities, competition nerds like ourselves, to try and find solutions that can help abet this kind of phenomenon. So there is a rising expectation that competition law can do something about these price increases. But at the same time, I think it is fair to say that we should not overburden the competition law regime. If I recall, and Vice Chair Nguyen of the Vietnam Competition Authority can attest to this as being a co-negotiator in the early days of the WTO in the World Trade Organization in Geneva. In a sense, those heightened negotiations, all the forward movement done in the international trade system probably led those WTO nerds as well to think that the international trade system can cure all the ills of the world. And that's why you started finding trade and competition related negotiations, trade and investment, trade and development, trade and labor. And so everything was being lumped into the WTO basket simply because it was proving effective in solving many of the ills of the world. And we find the same kind of conundrum now in competition. People are looking at competition law and saying, well, you've proven effective in addressing failures in markets, inefficiencies. Those which have consumer protection chapters in their competition law have proven equally effective in addressing unfair trade practices. So maybe the rising cost of living is another one of those which ought to be lumped with competition law. But I think it is important to bear in mind that there are other costs, there are other variables at play in the rising cost of living. It's not only market barriers, it's not only cartels or abuse of dominance, because you would find that in a lot of countries, the rising cost of living is traceable to imported inflation, rising costs which are happening in other countries. With an increasingly globalized world, it is very hard to avoid external shocks caused by rising prices where, for instance, goods are primarily imported into a country. My seatmates, Singapore and Hong Kong, obviously would feel this because a lot of the commodities consumed in their economies are imported from outside your territories. So a lot of the rising cost probably owes to imported inflation. In the same way, supply chain shocks to the system cause this kind of phenomenon. When Ukraine was invaded by Russia, when the war persisted, there were various allegations that this disrupted supply chains and hence caused systemic shock to how inflation was becoming more pervasive. In the same way, for instance, when the current US administration imposed higher fees for shipping lines which are built or operated by a certain country, and because that country provides a lot of the shipping services around the world, you felt again the increase, another round of prices being escalated. And then of course, for countries like the Philippines where climate change is very much felt, where typhoons inundate us 25 times a year, you have these climate disruptions which cause production to be affected. And just as an aside, because we're among ASEAN brothers and sisters, you know, some legislators in the Philippines keep clamoring for subsidies from ASEAN because the Philippines acts as a buffer for the rest of ASEAN in absorbing the brunt of typhoons in the region. So, of course, that is more like a pipe dream more than anything else. Now, having said that, where can competition law help? And I think I mentioned earlier that by having a surgical approach, i.e. by targeting basic commodities and prime necessities, we can more effectively prioritize areas or commodities where competition law can help. And these relate to the commodities which are critical to putting food on the table, feeding people, or allowing them to conduct their normal day-to-day lives. And this relate to, for instance, rice, because we are in ASEAN, you know, fuel and energy costs, because as we try to out-incentivize one another in ASEAN, energy costs, utility costs lie at the heart of what drives investment decisions, the same way as transport and logistics do. Healthcare, of course, pharmaceutical products, like in conversations with the Thai Competition Commission before. This is a shared goal in terms of addressing the cost of health, the cost of being able to provide hospital services. Now, as I said, there are limits to competition law, and what is obvious is that competition law does not always offer immediate crisis relief. When you have rising costs, people clamor for immediate relief. Competition law cannot do that. In the Philippines, we take at least 2 years in most cases to conclude an investigation, right? In some cases, it takes longer. And it's not unique to the Philippines. Second, there are long-term solutions offered by competition law and not quick fixes. Because competition law tries to address conditions of competition, it tries to provide for long-term solutions in how markets should operate, not in terms of imposing price caps or price freezes. Okay? Now, if we go into the question of trying to regulate prices as a way to address the cost of living issue, then the question is, are we going to step into the fringes of what is commonly known as price regulation, the ambit of sector regulators? And what is our credibility in doing that? Because we are not trained as price regulators. Will it risk overloading the system again? The issue that I was referring to earlier. Will it incur credibility risk if we get things, the computations wrong? Now, that said, as I mentioned earlier, there are underutilized legal hooks or provisions in different competition agencies. I mentioned in the slides the particular provisions in the Philippine Competition Act with reference to unfair prices that may be imposed, particularly as they refer to MSMEs, farmers and fisherfolk, to shield them from exploitative pricing by traders who are dominant in the geographic areas where these producers operate. In Hong Kong, for instance, the fish market, as Samuel will talk about later, is going to ferret out the importance of addressing concerns of people who are critical to supplying food that we all enjoy in restaurants in Hong Kong, right? But this situation in the Philippines of legal hooks is not unique to us, because if you look at the laws of Malaysia, Iskandar can verify this. They have a provision also which prohibits unfair pricing. The same with Thailand, the same with Vietnam. So what is the point? Well, you have these legal hooks, but they are not frequently enforced. They're rarely enforced. And why is that? Well, I think it goes back to what I was referring to earlier in terms of how do we know that we are doing things right? Because we are not price regulators, how do we know that we are benchmarking the prices for commodities the right way? How do we know it's unfair? How do we know it's excessive? That is the ambit, as I mentioned earlier, of price regulators. Secondly, in terms of many ASEAN jurisdictions, they don't have the same legal hooks. So if prices increase in those countries, then you also would bear the brunt of imported inflation, like I mentioned earlier. And therefore, as a closing slide, I would suggest that in terms of how we relate competition law, our enforcement tools available to authorities, and the kind of redress that cost of living demands or requires of us, we must bear in mind that while competition law is essential, it is not omnipotent. It is not a cure-all. It does not offer a universal remedy. It has to be taken in conjunction with flanking measures from other policy perspectives, right? So it operates best when coupled with consumer protection, as was very well pointed out in the earlier session today. It has to be surgically enforced in terms of the kind of targets that have to be prioritized by competition authorities. And secondly, or thirdly, or fourthly, we have to be mindful of avoiding the successful trap that we may find ourselves in, thinking that competition law can cure all of these ills on its own. So the path forward probably lies in the examples that have been undertaken by certain countries, and hence I look forward to what Samuel, Iskandar, and John will talk about in their respective jurisdictions, showing how competition law, not by way of price fixing, not by way of price freezes, but by way of strategic enforcement, have usefully been able to address at least sectoral issues relating to rising cost of living. I'll end with that. Thank you, Cindy.
Thank you so much. Now that Mr. Johannes has managed our expectations on what competition law can do, perhaps I'll pass the time now to Samuel, who will share with us a success story.
Yes, thank you, Cindy. And but before I share the Hong Kong experience, I must express our sincere gratitude to CCCS and particularly Chair Max and CEO Alvin for having us here. Now, I can agree more with what Johannes has just shared. I mean, and if I may just pick up his observation about this over-expectation on what Commission authorities or agencies may do on this question of alleviating the question of cost of living. Now, I remember that ever since I took up, I became a board member of HKCC in 2016, and a few years later I took up the chairmanship. And ever since that time, the most frequently asked question that I have is the question of what HKCC has been doing or can do in bringing down the gasoline prices in Hong Kong. As some of you may know, Hong Kong has the highest auto fuel prices in the world. Now, well, that question can be coming from the media, from my own family and friends. Now, what they seem to have forgotten, or what they seem to have refused to admit, is the fact that there are, as Johannes put it, many drivers for high prices. And actually, the government in Hong Kong has openly expressed its unwillingness to bring down auto fuel prices in a paper tabled at the Legislative Council meetings. Now, of course, I'm paraphrasing the words, but it's very true that there are a lot of expectation and sometimes perhaps unrealistic expectation on the part of what we can do. Now, having said that, of course, I don't mean that Commission Authority can sit back, relax, and do nothing. On the contrary, HKCC has been working very hard towards doing at least something, trying to bring down the cost of living in Hong Kong. And I would very much like to share our experience in our enforcement work in relation to the fish market in Hong Kong. What happened was, just to set the background, I think local marine or local fish market consumption takes up about 32.5% of the entire fish consumption in Hong Kong. So you can see how important, how relevant it is to the cost of living of the people in Hong Kong. And around November 2022, we were approached by the Hong Kong police, in fact by the Organized Crimes and Trials Bureau of Hong Kong Police in Hong Kong. They were at that time targeting against some gangster or triad elements or activities in one of the wholesale fish market in Hong Kong, which happened to be located very close to our office. So it's just natural for us to do something. But the problem is at that time we don't have sufficient information or evidence that will meet the legal threshold under our ordinance to start using our investigation powers. So we thought, well, since this is an important subject, we might as well just tag along and see what we can do. So in the first joint operation, which involves not only the police, not only HKCC, but also other government departments like the Immigration Department, the Fisheries and Agriculture Department, and so on and so forth, we went along and we conducted some voluntary inquiries by way of survey or questionnaires, trying to understand what was going on in wholesale fish markets. And that exercise, although not strict speaking, not an exercise of power under our ordinance or investigation powers, it turns out to have very good results. So much so that a month after that, we managed to have sufficient evidence to apply for a search warrant from the court. And we conducted another joint operation with the local police. And we managed to gather further evidence, and then 6 months down the road, we executed further search warrants, and we even exercised for the very first time our power to gain forced entry, not only to the wholesale fish market, but also to offices of the undertakings behind. Now, the point I'm trying to make is that in trying to do something about alleviating the cost of living in Hong Kong, sometimes we need to be, we as Commission authorities need to be a bit more creative and more robust. Because, as I mentioned just now, we didn't really have the power or the sufficient evidence to allow us to exercise our investigation power. But we didn't give up, and we tag along, and it turns out that we are able to gather more evidence, which paved the way for our subsequent action. Now, because the investigation is still ongoing, so there's a limit to what I can disclose. But I think the takeaway that I would like to share is perhaps threefold. Now, remember yesterday the senior Minister of State mentioned win-win-win. Now, what I can come up with in this project, which we call Project White Whale, is perhaps one letter, PPP. I would say persistence, partnership, and precision. Now, persistence, if we as Commission Authority are really serious about doing something to bring down the cost of living for our community, I think sometimes we have to persist, even though when we look at the ordinance, even though when we make an internal analysis and come to the conclusion that, well, it seems that well, we have to struggle a bit because we haven't met the legal threshold to use our investor powers under the ordinance. But the persistence is important, and because at least we persisted in this project, we managed to dig out a lot of useful information, and because we managed to smell something fishy, because we were talking about fish market, right? so we persist. Now the second P is partnership, and I think it's important for us to bear in mind that sometimes we as a commission authority can't be a lone wolf. We can't be a lone warrior. We have to partner up with other law enforcement agencies or other statutory bodies. In this case, the police, and actually in other instances which involve speed rigging in Hong Kong, we're talking about the building maintenance projects of different housing estates or even standalone buildings. We have been working closely with the police and also the Independent Commission Against Corruption. I think it's important because as a quote-unquote tiny agency, we do not have sufficient resources to go after a lot of anti-competitive behavior. But then other enforcement agencies will have a lot more resources, not only in terms of manpower, but also in terms of intelligence network. So that partnership proves to be very useful and very successful. Now the third P is what I call precision. And like Johannes, you mentioned, you have to be surgical. So by precision in this project, White Whale, what we have learned is that different commercial activities, different anti-competitive behaviors might involve different business jargons, different ways of communication between the undertakings, and especially in the fisheries sector. A lot of the jargons are simply foreign to us. And the way the credit system they've been using is very different from the normal credit system we may be able to find in normal retail or hotel sectors. So we need to be able to pick up those jargons and those peculiar business dealings. So that's what I mean by precision. So those are the takeaways I'd like to share in this fish market project, which turns out to be very successful and a project which helped build up our reputation in the eyes of the community in Hong Kong.
Thank you so much, Samuel. I think we will be picking up on the topic of partnerships a little bit later, but until then, can I invite Dr. Haji Iskandar to tell us about what's going on in Malaysia?
Yes, I think I have slides also. Can I have the controller? Yeah. Thank you so much. You see, after listening to Johannes and Samuel, I think MyCC is the only agency, competition agency in this world that has direct correlation to cost of living. Do you know why? Because we are an agency of Ministry of Domestic Trade and Cost of Living. Yeah. But thank God, it is the ministry who has to take care of the issue of cost of living in Malaysia. You see. But, you see, we play an important role in the sense that, we complete them. Yeah. I always say to them, we are the missing piece of your jigsaw puzzle. Without competition policy and law, basically, you can't cure the reason behind all this conundrum. I give you an example and an analogy. Yeah, let's say you have a fever. Yeah, but fever is just a symptom. And then, how do you treat the fever? You can't always take Panadol or paracetamol at all times. Maybe the next day the fever will come again. So what do? We go to the root cause of the fever, usually. So eventually we found out that the reason for the fever is because of the infection. So the competition agency is like the antibiotics. Yeah. So that's how we act. That's how we complete them. Yeah. So if you look into the issue of cost of living, Johannes has explained a bit what kind of components and the cost of living. For us, there are six main things. Yeah, we have transportation, you have utilities, you have food. Yeah, we have housing, healthcare, and others. Others include education, entertainment, and basic clothing and whatnot. Yeah, many members of the public, they are confused. They thought cost of living is about supporting their lifestyle. It's not about that. If you are so fond of Starbucks coffee or Luckin coffee, that is not about, it's not our duties. Yeah, it's not the duties of the government. Yeah, we just can only ensure that you have the sugar and the basic coffee. That's all. The rest, oat milk, whatever it is, you have to work hard for that. Right? So anyhow, Malaysia is divided into two parts. Yeah, there's one Peninsula Malaysia, and then the other part is Sabah and Sarawak, which is part of the Borneo Islands. Yeah, so every car manufacturers are based in Peninsula Malaysia. Every car importers are basically based in Peninsula Malaysia. So how does the people in Sabah and Sarawak get all their cars? From Peninsula through roll-on, roll-off ferries. Yeah. So about 7 to 8 years ago, we received a complaint from a new player in this Ro-Ro ferry market. Yeah. So they complained to us. For your information, because of this, you see, people in Sabah and Sarawak, they have to pay more for their cars because of the transportation costs. Yeah, they have to pay about 3,000 ringgit. It's about 1,000 Sing dollar. Yeah. So all this while, it has been monopolized by this one company, Giga. Yeah, we call it them Giga. It's actually, there's two companies but owned by one person. Yeah, so they are called Giga Shipping and Nexus Mega Carriers. So they came to us, they said, okay, Iskandar, there's something wrong with this market. When we approach all the car manufacturers, they refuse to give their cars for us to transport the cars to Sabah and Sarawak. We are bleeding now. Please do something about it. Yeah, this is more or less something about, cost of living, because we know that if we support the new player, the people in Sabah and Sarawak will have to pay. We can, somehow will get the opportunity to pay less for the transportation costs. But we fail. For your information, we fail. Yeah, because the thing is, coincidentally at that point of time, every car manufacturers, every car importers, they sign an exclusive agreement with the monopoly. So we investigated, but in competition law, you must put this action into motion, in a sense that you must you are not there to find fault. You just have to correct the market behavior, but it needs time. Yeah, like you treat an infection, it needs time. You need to take your antibiotic from 3 to 7 days. Yeah. So anyhow, eventually the new company went bust, but we managed to get an undertaking from the monopoly, to allow new players if there is. But for your information, there are still the monopoly, because nobody dares to go into that market. Yeah. So the next case is that about chicken. Everybody eats chicken here, yeah, especially our children. Yeah. Anyhow, chicken is the most cheapest protein in the world. Yeah. Put aside eggs. Yeah. Anyhow, 2-3 years ago, Malaysia had this issue on the increased pricing of chicken. So, our ministry had to do something, so they control the price of chicken, but they were facing pressures from the chicken retailers saying that, oh, we can't sell at that price, you have to give us more subsidy and whatnot. So the government asked us to investigate. So the reason behind the price increase was not because the retailers was simply raising their prices or simply forming a cartel. It is because of the chicken feed prices. We found out that the chicken feed millers is the one who caused all these issues. You see, 70% of the cost to rear a chicken rests on the chicken feed. If the prices of the chicken feed goes up, then everything goes up. And we have so many integrated players in Malaysia. People take for granted their chicken. All they want is chicken tender, whatever it is they want, a wing top and so on. Yeah, but once the price goes up, everybody will go mad. But the thing is, when we talk about cost of living, it's about something that has to do with the basic needs of the people. So you have to act quickly in the sense that, but here we had to investigate the whole Malaysia. We work with the police. We also work with the police. Thank God for the police. Yeah. Because we have one office only in Kuala Lumpur. Anyhow, and then another thing about Roro. Okay, this is a very funny story. Yeah, I don't know whether all of some of you have been to Langkawi, the tourist island of Malaysia, one of the most popular island in Malaysia, Langkawi. Langkawi does not produce anything. 98% they import from the mainland. Yeah, for their chicken, for their food and clothing and whatnot. So everything has to be transported through Roro again, roll on, roll off ferry. So and then the ministry came to us and said, Iskandar, everything, prices of everything in Langkawi has gone up by 20-30%. We don't know why. Yeah. So can you check? So we checked. Then we found out that the ferry operators, 3 ferry operators, or in fact 5, yeah, 2 of them connected to 1, yeah, 5 of them, they somehow signed an MOU. There was an MOU, black and white. You're not talking about informal agreement here. There was an MOU. So that's why. So going back to the components of cost of living, transportation plays a lot of role. Yeah. So if the price of transportation goes up, everything will go up. Yeah. And in the end, Dato' Indra will receive a lot of complaint after this. Yeah. So anyhow, we managed to defeat this another Roro issue. So we find them around almost 700,000 Sing dollar. Yeah. So, last but not least, last point, sorry, yeah. Whatever it is, we are not a price regulator. People always confuse us with price regulator and competition regulator. Consumers, the first thing that they have issue is the pricing. When last time when we buy properties, we said, the 3 main criteria is location. No more. It's about pricing. Yeah. So, but you see, we are not price regulator. So we have to tell them that our job is to ensure there's supply, there's choices, then only the market will work very well. Yeah. So when we intervene when there's apparent consumer harm in the market. Yeah. And we will take time. And we always told we've been telling our ministry, we need time to overcome all these issues. These cartel issues is not easy. These monopolist issues are also not easy. So in the meantime, you have to do your part. And we are going to do our part. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much. That's all.
Thank you so much, Dato' Haji. I want to keep the conversation flowing. We will come back later to, everybody playing their part. But meanwhile, Dr. John Small.
Thank you very much, Cindy, and thank you very much to the CCCS for inviting me to this wonderful conference, even though New Zealand's not actually a member of ASEAN. I think we're called a dialogue partner or something like that. So it's nice, it's lovely to be here and have this time with you all. So look, what I'd like to talk about is the grocery sector in New Zealand, and it's kind of an illustration of some of the themes that have already come up here, so I'll just sort of run through a few things, and you'll pick up a few themes, I think. So the first thing about the New Zealand grocery sector is it's very, very concentrated. There's basically two networks, and those two networks run between them 4 different banners. So it looks like 4 networks when you're walking down the street, but there's 2 companies that control it. And one of those companies is split between the 2 islands, New Zealand's North Island and South Island, and it's got the same banners in both islands, but it's different companies that run them in the North and South Island, and they're both cooperatives. They're retailer-owned cooperatives, and we love cooperatives in New Zealand, and this is a kind of a Kiwi battler cooperative that's up against the corporate Australian giant Woolworths. So that's basically the structure. Now I have to admit the New Zealand Commerce Commission, we're kind of first troublemaker in this sector. There were some concerns about it, but then we did a market study into this sector in about 2021. And we found, basically it's pretty obvious, got a fairly severe structural problem. That these 2 companies essentially control about 85% of the grocery market, and there's a little bit of fringe competition here and there. And so we also saw quite a lot of behavioural problems as well. And those are the sort of things that you sometimes see in concentrated retail markets. One was bullying of suppliers. So particularly, the big multinational suppliers are kind of okay, they can look after themselves, but moderate-sized and smaller suppliers were pretty terrified, frankly, of the power of the supermarkets, and they're too terrified to tell us things, in fact, but you hear things whispered. So that was one issue, and another one was customer confusion in store. Just this proliferation of confusing price mechanics and promotional discounts that went up and down like yo-yos and seemed to swap between the networks week about and that kind of stuff. So it didn't look very good. And in our study, we initially sort of said in our draft report, this is really a structural problem, so maybe there needs to be a structural solution here. And it kind of alarmed a lot of people in the country, the idea that the antitrust regulator might suggest that this is really actually a deeply structural problem. We pulled back from that in our final and said, well, okay, yeah, maybe that's it. Maybe we should do the Kiwi thing and start with some behavioural regulation, see if that'll fix it. So the public response to all that was huge, and the government jumped in and they passed a special law governing the grocery sector, the Grocery Industry Competition Act. And I guess the 2 of the main things of that were, one was a supplier code of conduct to address the bullying issue, and a core part of that was negotiating in good faith, whatever that means, and a few other provisions. And then the other part was a wholesale market regulatory regime. Now that sounds slightly telco-like, but when you've got 10,000 SKUs in a supermarket, it's a slightly different ballgame. And so we've done this in a graduated way. We've essentially, the law is set up so that the 2 big companies have to put out a wholesale offer to the market, and we assess that and we keep an eye on that. And it's kind of the theory behind that wholesale measure was that it will enable fringe competitors, the small firms that are already there, to get groceries at a better price and be able to compete with the majors. And that also potentially, if somebody wanted to come in on a large scale, it would give them what we thought would probably be a temporary access to a wide range of groceries. Because the dominant business model seems to be that a big retailer wants their own supply network anyway. So that was the theory. And so off we went. So since that, it was a couple of years ago, we've really used a range of tools in this sector. Some of it's competition law, but there's a whole lot of other stuff in there as well. So I thought I'd just run through a few of these categories to give you a sense of how we've approached it. I think it fits with the surgical approach because it's focused in on this one sector, but it's also a kind of multi-tool strategy. We heard earlier in the previous session about the balancing between competition law and consumer protection. So we've got both of those sets of tools, but in this case we've got the third one as well, which is that Grocery Industry Competition Act. So, starting at the soft end, soft power. So one of the first things we did was we wrote to the supermarkets and said, hey, your pricing integrity is lousy. There's a whole lot of people, because we'd seen this, you go into a supermarket and you see something on the shelf for $1, and when you get to the checkout it's $1.20. We call that pricing integrity problem. And said, hey, look, you've got a pricing integrity problem, you've got to fix that. And we wrote an open letter. So all of this is about ramping up public pressure on them. So an open letter that gets published in the paper and says, Commerce Commission says these guys are hopeless at pricing integrity, got to get better. They didn't really. I don't know what they thought was going to happen, but so we eventually took a few of them to court. We sent some people around, collected up some evidence, got some prosecutions, and we started publicising those as well. And eventually now, just a couple of months ago, one of them has said, oh, look, hey, we're going to spend $5 million getting our pricing integrity sorted out. Okay, great. Slow learners, but, that's good. Another soft power thing, I suppose, was we had a situation where a breakfast cereal manufacturer cut off supply to one of these fringe retailers, the biggest of the fringe retailers. And we found out about it about 3 days before it was going to happen. And this is a kind of iconic New Zealand breakfast cereal called Wheat Bix that everybody loves, And so we thought, oh, what are we going to do about this? And so I spoke to our grocery guy and we said, let's nail them in the media. So we went out in the media and said, we're asking for a please explain. We want to know why are you cutting off supply to these people, and we want to know now. And we got some internal blowback on that, to be honest, because some of our internal people were going, oh, you can't do that. What if you've got to prosecute them? How can we prosecute a case like this? And our take was, we're not going to prosecute them, they're going to back down. You watch. And they did, of course, because they're embarrassed, they're all over the news. And so a couple of days later they decided that they did have some Wheat Bix after all, and the problem was solved. So that kind of soft power, raising consumer expectations, embarrassing them publicly, I think works pretty well. Then there's some other stuff about disclosure, shining a light on what's going on. So one of the things we're doing here is a consumer complaints disclosure standard, and we put this in. This is through the Grocery Act, and basically it says, hey, you guys, you big supermarkets, you've got to report to us regularly on the pattern of consumer complaints that you're getting, and the reason we did that is because they don't know, they don't keep track of what consumer complaints they're getting because they don't have to. They just kind of ignore it. And so this is pushing them to put in a system to track the complaints and, basic business that they should really be doing and would be doing in a competitive market. So that's, but also a pretty soft tool. It's just an information disclosure tool. A couple of other things, some competition cases. We prosecuted some of them on covenants. This duopoly has had, by the way, one of the interesting things about this whole program of work is that everyone in New Zealand now knows what a duopoly is, which I take that as we'll take a win there. So, but one of they've been building up real estate portfolios for decades, and they've got, and sometimes they don't want, and I know the Canadians have had issues with this as well. Sometimes they see a site that could be a supermarket and it's near theirs, and so they buy it because they don't want their rival to buy it. But then they don't want all that capital sitting around, and so they put a covenant on it that says you can do anything with the site except a supermarket, and then they sell the land, get it off their balance sheet, and so then it's just sitting there. And somebody has to do something else with it. So, it's blatantly anti-competitive. So we took a couple of cases on that. We also used our cartel team on a supplier bullying case, which I probably did not talk about all the details of, but it was a cunning way of getting what we hope is going to be a prosecution in situations where, because sometimes we find out about this supplier bullying, and then as soon as we go to the supplier and say, hey, can you give us evidence, they go, oh no, sorry, I'm a bit scared about that. I'd rather you just drop it, because I don't want to be the troublemaker here, because they'll get me later. But if they've already gone into a deal, even if they were bullied into a deal, then that's a different matter. They may not be able to back out. So that's an interesting case, and also a merger. In the middle of all this stuff, you wouldn't believe it, in the middle of all of this work, the cooperative that I said was split between the two islands applied to us for permission to merge between the two islands. I mean, the brass neck of it. And they didn't succeed. So, but it's being appealed. So look, I think what I take from this, I'll wrap up, is that I think soft power can be quite effective, particularly if you're going straight to the public, because then that raises expectations. These people all feel like their social licence is under some sort of threat, and I think you should play on that. And the other thing on their side of it is that when you talk to these business people in their boardrooms, they all genuinely think that they are doing great by the country, that they're creating jobs, fulfilling consumer needs. They feel good about themselves, and they like to feel good about themselves. And so if there's some things that they're really not doing right, you can kind of pierce that confidence, and that's the kind of thing that leads to a culture change. We talked yesterday about a culture of competition, and I think until people actually look in the mirror and say, oh, maybe I'm not perfect, the cultures don't change. I'll stop there.
Thank you to all our distinguished panelists. I've been given to understand that our panelists do want to ask each other questions, so that makes my job a little bit easier. So first question from Johannes.
Yes, thank you, Cindy. And I will put my co-panelists on the spot, because we were talking earlier about how effective your various enforcement actions have been, but at the same time, while they address the systemic issues in terms of the root or the cause of what makes prices go high, I think there's also a clamor for some immediate relief for certain core commodities or prime commodities that are suffering from escalated prices and from which our ordinary citizens are asking for redress or solutions on. And I was going to push what my friend Iskandar had stated earlier about the fact that competition authorities are not price regulators. And I think there's broad agreement amongst us that that is a fact. That's conventional wisdom. But I hearken back to an experience we had in the Philippines when reviewing the Grab-Uber merger. During the commitment period, where we imposed a cap on the post-transaction prices that Grab can charge vis-a-vis the pre-transaction prices that they had charged, we found that while the cap that we had put was effective for that period of time, and every time Grab violated that margin, they were penalized. Once the commitment period had lapsed, the prices of Grab fares in the Philippines just escalated and continued to escalate. So in that sense, would you not say that the price cap imposed by the competition authority was effective in regulating prices of a core service that was being offered to address the transport problems in the Philippines? Wasn't it effective in terms of regulating prices? If we're saying we're not price regulators, then why did it prove so effective then? And why did the lapse of the commitment period now evidence a spike in prices which not even the sector regulator is able to control? So that's one. The second is, like Malaysia, the Philippines also has this unfair pricing mechanism, the tool that allows us to prohibit and seek liability from entities which impose unfair prices. If it is in the law, doesn't it behoove us to enforce, to make effective those provisions? I know that there's difficulty in trying to establish what is the appropriate benchmark for prices and what constitutes excessive pricing based on those benchmarks. And certainly the Philippines is not one to be emulated, because before, 5 years, 7 years ago, when we tried to have the Department of Trade implement some kind of rational price regulation according to their own mandate, what we found out was, the way that they determine prices, they would gather all the producers of a particular good and say, how much are you charging? How much are you charging? What's your cost of production? In a setting which actually enabled the Department of Trade as the price regulator to act as a cartel facilitator by that exchange of information. So certainly that's not the way to benchmark prices, but I suppose in your experience, having been in the competition field longer and now being outside the competition authorities of the Philippines mandate, perhaps you can shed light on these two issues. How do you now address the situations where, number one, price capping or price regulation has proven effective in terms of merger review and regulation for competition authorities to actually mitigate price increases subsequent to mergers? And secondly, in situations where we do have that legal provision in our laws, doesn't it behoove us to operationalize it, even if conventionally we are not price regulators? Shouldn't we push the envelope in that sphere?
Can I answer that?
Yes, please.
You see, a few years back, we were asked to find out why the price of cement in Malaysia suddenly shot up. Yeah, and then what we found is that there's a dominant player in Malaysia. They control around 60 to 70% of the market, and then the rest shared by 4 or 5 companies. Yeah. So we told them, because this market leader, when they, usually when the market leader raise their prices, everybody will follow. Yeah. Because they don't want to lose out the opportunities and whatnot. There's so many reasons behind that. So we told the government, you have to change your industrial policies. Yeah, you have to look into other measures. Yeah, it's not market failure. Yeah, maybe close to regulatory failure or policy failure. So, but I was astonished by this. One of the committee members. Then how much it should be, Iskandar, per bag? I said, we are not a price regulator. No, how much, Iskandar? Tell me. 3 times, and I refuse to give a number to them. Because we can't simply encroach to an area where we are not the one who's going to, create all these numbers or the pricing or whatsoever. It's very, very risky and dangerous for us. Because once you start to encroach into somebody's turf, and then that tag will stay forever with you. There's a risk it will stay forever. Oh, last time you did this, okay, now why can't you do it now? Yeah. And once we did this market review, John, we did this market review on food. We did market review on fish. We did market review on beef, vegetables, infant formula. I still remember. We were blasted by this Ministry of Agriculture. Why are you encroaching into our, our territory? This is not your field. You are not an agricultural officer. You see? But I told them, it's just us, we are just like that. We have to be the jack of all trades. We have to be the all-rounder. We have to know about the market. Yeah, we have to take care. We have to help the government in some components of cost of living. So what we are telling you is that there's something wrong with the supply and the supply chain and your policy and whatnot. Yeah, that's all we are telling you. Yeah, and then there's a solution for you that we are recommending. Yeah, that's all we have to do. Yeah, so you have to put a line, a boundary between price regulator and a competition. Yeah, it's very dangerous. Yeah, yes, our ministry has this power under Price Control Act. Yeah, and Price Control and Anti-Profiteering Act. Yeah. So our role is that don't you put all these traders in one room. We told them many times. It took us years to get them to agree with us. Before this day, we call all these traders from all these associations and discuss about pricing. Okay, how much we're going to sell the chicken for the Aidil Fitri, for the Raya, for the Christmas, Deepavali and whatnot. They discuss openly, but you have to be careful there. You just have to tell them, please, there's 2 rules. If you want to call all these traders, don't let them to discuss about prices and the cost. That's all. The rest, I leave it to you. So, that's how we should do it. That's how we should approach it. And I agree to disagree. The fact that, price cap, I don't think so. Price cap is our job. Yeah. So that's my opinion.
I kind of agree with most of that, but I'll just raise, I guess, a couple of other points. One is that in some situations, like in a vertical supply chain, if you're worried about, with market power at one end, at least one end, then and somebody wants to get in at independently, that's not vertically integrated, then you've got the risk of a price squeeze issue, whereby a vertically integrated firm with market power can arrange their kind of wholesale and retail price in such a way to keep an entrant out. So in that sort of world, competition authority, I think, has got a role to say in saying these prices are wrong. It's not necessarily the level of them. It's the difference between them. This is anti-competitive. So I think there's some situations where you can get into it. The only other comment I was going to make, because there's been quite a bit about fairness and what's fair prices and so on. And I'm just going to reflect that, we have a thing in New Zealand that's relatively new in New Zealand called unconscionable conduct. And the test for that is subjective. The test for that is, would a normal person think this is wrong? And we're just starting to take some cases on that, but I think it's the kind of thing that could be, the cases we're taking are for vulnerable people with cognitive problems who have been hard sell, things that they couldn't possibly use, so really exploitive. But I think there could be some more, that range could be expanded. But I do wonder whether the fairness might be, whether you might, if it hasn't been tested in court, whether a subjective standard might be something that you could try, and if it gets slapped down, then you start again, but it might be worth pushing the envelope on.
Yeah, I think if I may just perhaps make this add on. Now, well, in Hong Kong, we don't have the equivalent of the price law or what Johannes described as the underutilized legal hooks. So that might give us a bit of a sort of excuse for for stepping back a bit on this question. But I would have thought that well, although it's quite tempting for commercial authorities to try to wear the head of the price regulator, but then it can be quite risky, at least in the context of Hong Kong, because a lot of times these exorbitant heists is the outcome of years of malpractice and also deeply ingrained trade practices, which may not manifest in a simple or a very simplistic level of price, no matter how high it may appear. If I just give an example, when we first started off our enforcement operations, we did quite a number of cases on public housing renovation or building decoration contractors. What happened was whenever a new public housing, whether for a low-income family group or for the middle-class families, was built, the housing department or the housing authority will have a list of authorized contractors, and they will then display their they will have their stores on perhaps on the ground floor of these newly built housing estates. And what happened was there was a clear-cut market allocation among these building decorators. Now, say if I'm a new owner and I try to get some very basic interior decoration, when I approached these stores, they will ask me, well, which floor, which unit are you coming from? I would say, well, 10th floor. Well, they would say, oh, sorry, you better go to that store A, not B. And then if you go to different store, you will find that they're actually distributing exactly the same pamphlets. And store A may charge $10,000, store B may charge $10,001 extra dollar for basically for the same set of basic renovation work. So clear-cut case of market location. Now, from our perspective, we are not too much concerned about whether it should cost $10,000 or it should cost $5,000. But the problem is really about market allocation. So how much they charge is really neither here nor there. And of course, behind all that, there's this, what I described or mentioned just as a deeply ingrained practice. Now, simple building decoration is a simple thing, but when you're talking about major building renovations of the entire housing estates, we've been doing quite a number of cases on these, and we're talking about hundreds of millions of Hong Kong dollars for each project, and each household can easily be required to chip in, say, $500 million. I'm struggling whether I should disclose my experience, but in my case, it's even higher than that for my own household. Now, now, as a commission authority, if we are going to wear the head of price regulator, how are we going to go about this? And on what basis will I be able to say, well, $500 million is too much? It should be $200,000. And don't you forget that there are different tiers of contractors involved. You have main contractors, subcontractors, sub-subcontractors, and you have the suppliers of those building materials. And the house and estate podium may involve different building materials, and the lift costs may involve another supplier. So no matter how tempting it might be, I would thought that all commercial authorities should be very slow to try to push the boundary of, price regulations. Well, that's my 2 cents.
Thank you so much. I'm going to jump in here and kind of summarize what I've heard from everybody. So what I'm hearing is that increasing prices are not always because of anti-competitive conduct. It's not always this kind of market failures. We are looking at global supply chain disruptions. We are looking at geopolitical shifts. So these are all issues that we're dealing with when it comes to rising cost of living. But I've also heard that there are success stories here in the region as well as globally. We have enforcement tools, we have soft powers, we have all different kind of levers that we can use to kind of help the situation, right? With competition law and policy, with incisive use, with creative and persistent efforts on our part. But I've also heard that we are not price regulators. There are limitations to what we can do. I have heard that we can kind of help matters along by forming partnerships with other stakeholders. I've heard partnerships with media, with police, with other authorities such as the anti-corruption agencies, competition protection agencies, consumer protection agencies. So maybe this is my parting kind of last question that I'm opening to every member of the panel is what kind of advice would you give to a competition authority in getting buy-in from all these different stakeholders to help us achieve this goal of managing cost of living issues? Anybody would like to start?
I'll take a shot at it. I think what is important is that when competition authorities continue their advocacy with different stakeholders, they set forth what competition authorities can do and what they cannot do. What are the limits of competition law and policy? Second is, I do agree that competition authorities should not be primarily price regulators. I do subscribe to the notion that there are limited cases, very focused and specific situations when competition authorities can weigh in on the issue of price caps. But in all cases, it has to be done in coordination with the sector regulator, right? And that is something which probably this conference has not touched on, this important issue about coordination and cooperation with sector regulators. The third element of it is that apart from being surgical and precise in targeting who will be or what will be the target of such endeavors of competition enforcement to address the rising cost of living, it has to be borne in mind as well that there are other flanking measures which address core variables which lie at the heart of price increases, the rising cost of living. So to the extent that competition authorities are able to identify policies in other government agencies which contribute to price hikes, I think then sectoral cooperation and coordination again comes to the fore, because it's not only in terms of price regulation, but in terms of aligning policies of other sector regulators to ensure that these rules and regulations they have in place do not themselves contribute to cost of living expenses and high prices in the economy are sufficiently addressed. And lastly, perhaps what I would also encourage competition authorities to do is to be proactive in identifying those goods, those services which are priorities for containing the increasing cost of living. I think most competition authorities have already gotten on the bandwagon of the importance of prioritization, right, in terms of enforcement priorities. And I think as we develop our enforcement priorities for succeeding periods of time, we have to be mindful that we have to address those sectors those goods which are directly impactful on the cost of living of ordinary citizens. Thank you.
If I may, on this question of buy-in, I think the most, perhaps, again, sharing from the Hong Kong experience, the most effective way is to prove that your enforcement outcomes are helpful, at least in this context of this panel, in the sense that they will at least give the impression that the prices will be coming down, although there may not be immediate quantification available. Again, using the example of building renovations, because this subject affects so many people in Hong Kong and in such a significant way, because we're talking about the sums involved are really enormous. But we keep on doing enforcement cases about bid rigging of major housing renovations. And I think the media and the people start buying in the value of the presence of the Commission Authority, GVCs, although we are relatively new body in Hong Kong, because it really affects their livelihood. And I think if I may echo perhaps one of the points shared by ACCC's speaker, is about enduring priorities. And a few years ago, we set 3 top priorities for enforcement work, which the first is any anti-competitive behavior which will affect people's livelihood. The second will be any anti-competitive conduct which will seek to exploit government subsidies, and finally digital economy. And because we've been sticking to these 3 priorities, in particular the first priority, over the past few years, I think we begin to feel that the community is really beginning to understand why we are doing what we are doing. So I think the buy-in, if the buy-in can come from the general public, that will be a good thing, because after all, policyholders, legislators will be concerned about what the constituency may think about the lively issues that they are facing.
The 3 main stakeholders for us is the consumer, the industries, and also the government. We try to focus on certain things. So now we are focusing on food and agriculture. A hungry man is an angry man. You always have to remember that. Take care of their stomach. Yeah. Okay. But at the same time, look into services such as like childcare, tire services, all these basic things that we can't live without. Maybe key making services, or key repairs, alarm, all the things that are basic to us. Yeah, so they will remember us. But don't forget your colleagues in other departments. They are facing another headache, which is bid rigging cartels. Help them. Yeah, these are the most important things. Yeah, do what matter most to the people, to your stakeholders, and you will be forever, be grateful of what you have done. Thank you. That's all.
That's nice. I wasn't expecting to get a Bob Marley quote. That's very good. I think it's about. I guess my closing comment would be building awareness is crucial, and so it touches on what Samuel was saying before. And if ordinary people understand what you're doing, then you're halfway there. And engaging with the business community is crucial in that, and the policy community. But the wider and more intensive that message gets out there, the easier our job will be, the greater will be the political support that we've got, and the more effective we will be. So I think for me it's quite a virtuous cycle, really.
Oh,
Thank you so much, everybody. I am conscious that a hungry man is an angry man. So when Dato' Haji Iskandar mentioned it, I was like, oh, look at the time. I'm sorry, and I'm conscious that I'm standing between everyone and their lunchtime. So I apologize that we don't have time for the general Q&A, but do catch them as we are having lunch outside. Please join me in a round of applause to our distinguished panelists.
Thank you, panelists, for the thought-provoking insights on how competition policy may help address cost of living issues. As we conclude the 11th ASEAN Competition Conference, we would like to invite Mr. Alvin Koh, Chief Executive of the Competition and Consumer Commission of Singapore, to deliver the closing remarks.
Hi everyone. I just wanted to correct Cindy for one little point that she made just now, which is that she's not the one standing between you and lunch. It's actually me that's standing between you and lunch. So it's just a few very short closing remarks. So distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, as we conclude the 11th ASEAN Competition Conference, I want to thank you for 2 days of productive discussions. And listening to the rich and insightful sessions, I want to express my optimism about the path ahead for competition policy in our region. These 2 days have been truly enriching. We came together recognizing that we are entering a new era, one shaped by digital transformation and new enforcement challenges, and we're leaving with practical solutions, deeper understanding, and strengthened partnerships that will guide our work for years to come. The breadth and quality of our discussions across 6 plenary sessions have been exceptional. Here, I just want to thank all of you for the very positive feedback and the team for carefully curating the program in the last 2 days. And just to recap, we explored how artificial intelligence can enhance our enforcement capabilities whilst addressing the unique and unprecedented challenges it creates. We've examined competition policy's measurable impact on economic growth, moving from theory to evidence-based approaches. We've also discovered how competition and consumer protection can work together more effectively, an insight that will transform our regional cooperation. A defining moment of this conference was the launch of the ASEAN Competition Action Plan 2026 to 2030, marking a new chapter in our collective commitment to building a more resilient ASEAN economy. And this roadmap, alongside the legal foundation provided by the ASEAN Framework Agreement on Competition, demonstrates that meaningful regional cooperation is not just possible, it's already happening. And the insights shared by over 20 speakers from across ASEAN and beyond have enriched our understanding of how competition policy can facilitate MSME integration into global value chains, address cost of living pressures, and navigate the complex landscape of digital markets. These aren't just academic discussions. These are practical blueprints for creating fairer, more effective markets that serve our communities. I hope that these blueprints will give you good food for thought and be a plan for you to act on as you return to your countries. More effectively, the relationships built here, the insights shared, and commitments made will strengthen our collective ability to address the evolving challenges facing our markets. What we have learned today will inform better policies, more effective enforcement, and ultimately fairer outcomes for businesses and consumers alike. I encourage you to keep this momentum alive. Continue the conversations that you have started here. Pursue the partnerships you have identified. Put the best practices into action, and together we'll ensure this new era for competition policy strengthens our economies, protects our consumers, and creates opportunities for everyone to thrive. And if I may, it is my hope that our great discussions here today can continue this afternoon with the CCCS conference, Shaping Tomorrow's Markets Today, a theme which explores current and emerging trends in competition and consumer protection compliance across Singapore and ASEAN, building on the foundations we've established here at the ACC. Let me express my deep appreciation to all our speakers and panelists for their invaluable insights, the ASEAN Secretariat for helping to organize this conference and making it such a success, and all our development partners for their continued support. A special shout out to my organizing team from CCCS, Yvette, Ashley, Candice and Raymond. I think you've seen them running around the last 2 days, so if you would join me in thanking them. And I also want to thank all of you for the great vibes, for contributing to these conversations that we've had over the last 2 days. I think it's been an honor for Singapore to host the ACC again after 12 years. With this, I bring the 11th ASEAN Competition Conference to a close. I look forward to seeing many of you this afternoon as we continue our discussions at the CCCS conference and to our continued partnership in building a more competitive and consumer-friendly ASEAN. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Koh, for the insightful closing remarks. Distinguished delegates, thank you for your active participation and valuable contribution to this landmark conference. The meaningful discussions and exchanges over these 2 days will